No spin, no igniter test, no warning. SpaceX just fired all 33 engines on Booster 20 at once, and in the next 25 seconds, it broke every record the company has ever set. But here's the number nobody's talking about yet. 9 of those engines had already been pulled off a different booster after a hard shutdown months earlier. We'll get to that in a minute. Right now, watch what just happened on a launch pad that had never taken a full power test before. 9 engines. That's the number we left hanging. 9 engines pulled off a different booster after a hard shutdown, violent enough that the flight computer killed the test mid-burn, then set aside for weeks as a precaution against hidden damage. And those same 9 engines just fired flawlessly for 25 straight seconds, longer than any 33 engine static fire SpaceX has ever run. So the question isn't just what happened. It's how do engines that were pulled for caution end up setting a record a few weeks later? Let's rewind to the moment that number actually mattered. The engines that went quiet for weeks. Back during Booster 19's very first static fire, something went wrong fast. The technical term is a hard shutdown, which is engineer language for the flight computer deciding mid-test that continuing would be risky and killing the burn before it turned into something worse. 9 engines were pulled from that booster immediately, not because they were confirmed broken, but as a precaution in case the shutdown had caused hidden damage, not waved through. Shipped out to McGregor, Texas, SpaceX's dedicated engine test facility, for inspection and, presumably, plenty of additional testing. They simply vanished from public view for weeks. Here's what almost nobody outside SpaceX knew until this week. Those same 9 engines, plus one more from the inner ring, were quietly bolted onto Booster 20. Engines that had been pulled off the line after a hard shutdown, sidelined out of caution, were about to be trusted with the most demanding static fire SpaceX has ever attempted on a launch pad that had never been tested at full power before. Think about that decision for a second. If you were running this program, would you put engines that had just been pulled for inspection back on the line for the biggest test yet? SpaceX did. And you're about to find out exactly what that gamble bought them. While those engines sat quietly in Texas, Pad 2 itself was going through its own version of a final exam. Days before Booster 20 ever rolled anywhere near it, SpaceX ran the tower's catch arms, the ones nicknamed Mechazilla, from the very top of the structure, exactly as if they were catching a returning super heavy booster, right arm first. Open, close, dozens of times, starting slow, then pushing toward what looked like their absolute speed limit. Then the left arm ran the same gauntlet. Here's the detail that should catch your attention. Every single time those arms moved, the entire tower shook. And SpaceX wasn't just filming the arms for content. They were measuring how that shaking built up, whether it faded out cleanly or compounded into something worse. Because a tower that resonates at the wrong frequency at the wrong moment isn't a tower you want holding a fully fueled super heavy booster 30 stories in the air. You think that's the last surprise from the tower testing? It's not. The old hydraulic arms used to wobble hard when they stopped moving. The new electric actuators just stop. Clean. Almost no shake at all. That's not a minor spec upgrade. That's the difference between a machine that fights its own momentum on every single motion and one that simply obeys the moment you tell it to stop. So by the time Booster 20 rolled out Thursday afternoon, Chinese wrapped, a fresh coat of black paint around the aft section, the pad underneath it had already proven its bones. What it hadn't proven yet was whether it could survive fire. No spin, no igniter, just fire. This is the part of the story that actually earns the word breaking. Every previous super heavy static fire followed the exact same script, without exception. Step 1, spin prime, spinning up the turbopumps without actually lighting fuel, essentially a dress rehearsal to confirm the plumbing works under pressure. Step 2, igniter testing, confirming the spark system is ready to go. Only after both boxes were checked would the engines actually fire. Booster 20 skipped both steps entirely. For the first time on any super heavy booster in the program's history, SpaceX went straight from cold hardware to full ignition. No rehearsal, no warm-up, just fire immediately on command. Why would anyone do that? Because spin prime and igniter testing exist for one reason: to catch a problem before you commit 33 Raptor engines to full power at once. Skipping them isn't corner cutting. It's a confidence statement. It tells you SpaceX has run this exact engine configuration on this exact pad hardware enough times in simulation and ground testing that they trust the system to go straight to fire without the safety net almost every other rocket program in the world would refuse to remove. And then it just kept burning. 25 seconds. Not a quick cough of flame and shutdown. The longest 33-engine static fire SpaceX has ever run on a pad that had never taken a full duration burn before, using 9 engines that had been pulled off a different vehicle weeks earlier for precautionary inspection. Slow motion footage from that test shows the shockwave rolling across the flame trench hard enough to make the ground itself look like it's flinching. And the trench held. Pad 2, brand new, untested at full power until that exact instant, absorbed the most punishing 33-engine burn in company history and didn't blink. So here's the debt we owe you an answer to now. If engines that were pulled off the line out of caution can run flawlessly for 25 straight seconds on the very first full power test of a launch pad's toughest job, what does that actually tell you about how thoroughly SpaceX vetted them before putting them back on a booster? It tells you the hard shutdown wasn't ignored. It became the reason those 9 engines got tested harder than any others in the fleet. The twist. Nobody's framing correctly. Here's where most coverage of this test gets the story wrong. They're treating it as one test. It wasn't. It was 3 separate high-risk validations disguised as a single afternoon. Engines pulled off the line after a hard shutdown and cleared through inspection. A launch pad that had never absorbed full power before. Catch arms that had only just finished resonance testing days earlier. Stack all 3 of those unknowns into a single test, and most rocket programs would call that reckless. Space has called it Thursday, and there's a second layer sitting underneath that one. This exact test happened just days after SpaceX quietly dropped a behind-the-scenes video called Critical Path, showing off Pad 2's water deluge system in extreme detail. Buried in that footage, an engineer walks through the thermal sensors built to melt at specific, known temperatures, so the team can measure exactly how hot the flame trench got during a real burn. His own words, describing what came back after the most brutal test they'd run to that point: sub-Sharpie, meaning cooler than the melting point of a permanent marker, not cooler than steel, not cooler than concrete, cooler than office supplies, after arguably the most violent static fire SpaceX has ever conducted. Put all 3 pieces together. A pad engineered to stay cooler than a marker pen during the hardest burn in company history. Engines cleared through inspection after a previous hard shutdown. Catch arms that had just proven their resonance behavior days before. This wasn't a routine static fire that happened to go well. This was SpaceX stacking every unresolved risk from the last several weeks into one afternoon and walking away with a record. Now, let's go back to the root of why any of this matters beyond one impressive afternoon in South Texas. The FAA's own airspace and maritime notices, the official warnings that legally have to go out before any Starship launch, currently point to a window opening Wednesday, July 15th, running through the 21st. And critically, the hazard areas listed for Starbase, for Mexico, and for the Indian Ocean match Flight 12's profile almost exactly. That tells you SpaceX isn't planning anything wild or experimental for Flight 13. They're planning a clean repeat, targeting 3 specific fixes: a cleaner stage separation, a super heavy booster that performs without drama, no missing vacuum engine during Starship's ascent, the way earlier flights struggled with, and a clean in space Raptor relight. In other words, Flight 13's entire job is to prove those fixes actually work, so that Flight 14 can finally fly with real Starlink version 3 satellites instead of another dummy payload stack. So that 25-second static fire wasn't a standalone spectacle for social media. It was the last major checkpoint standing between Booster 20 and that exact mission. If it had stumbled, everything downstream, Flight 14's real payload, the entire runway toward orbital refueling, and eventually crewed lunar missions, would have slipped right along with it. Fresh actor injection, the other side of the planet. While SpaceX was proving out Pad 2, something happened on the opposite side of the globe that deserves far more attention than it's getting, and it connects directly to the story you just watched. China's new Long March 10B rocket flew for the first time on Friday. Roughly 6 minutes after stage separation, the booster began descending toward a recovery vessel waiting in open water. Here's the twist. This booster carries no landing legs at all. Instead, the recovery ship extends 4 arresting cables that close in as the booster enters a defined capture box. Hooks on the booster itself grab those cables mid-descent, and the vessel physically catches the entire stage. Now stop and compare that to what you just watched at Starbase. SpaceX spent an entire week fine-tuning giant mechanical arms down to the exact resonance frequency, building an entire steel tower purely to catch a booster with centimeter-level precision. China built a boat with cables on it. 2 completely different engineering philosophies aimed at solving the exact same problem. How do you stop throwing away a rocket booster after a single use? SpaceX bets on a fixed, ultra-precise tower system. China bets on a mobile capture vessel that doesn't need the booster to be nearly as accurate, just close enough and slow enough not to snap the cables. And here's the number that should genuinely surprise you. This makes China only the 3rd entity in history to successfully recover an orbital-class booster for reuse, joining SpaceX with both Falcon 9 and Starship, and Blue Origin with New Glenn. 3 completely different recovery systems, 3 completely different engineering bets, all proven within the same handful of years. For scale, Falcon 9's booster is 3.7 meters wide. New Glenn's is 7 meters. This new Chinese booster sits almost exactly between them at 5 meters. And Chinese officials say it could be refurbished and flying again before the end of this year. This rocket isn't a one-off test either. 3 of these boosters strapped together will eventually form the full Long March 10, the vehicle meant to carry China's next-generation crew capsule toward the moon. So while SpaceX races to prove Starship's catch system is ready for Flight 13 and beyond, China just quietly proved an entirely different capture method works too, on hardware explicitly built for its own lunar ambitions. That's not a coincidence. That's 2 space powers solving the same problem in parallel, on different timelines, aimed at the exact same destination. Why? The moon race runs through both of these tests. Here's the part that ties the whole story together. NASA's Artemis program depends heavily on Starship's ability to refuel in orbit, using exactly the kind of reusable booster infrastructure Booster 20 just proved out. Every successful catch, every clean static fire, every incremental improvement between Flight 12 and Flight 13 isn't just a SpaceX milestone. It's a milestone for the United States' entire timeline back to the lunar surface. And China just showed the world it doesn't need to copy SpaceX's exact playbook to make real progress toward the same goal. Different hardware, different capture method, same destination. That's why a 25-second static fire in South Texas and a cable capture off the coast of China happened in the same week, and why neither event is really the complete story on its own. They're 2 data points in the same race, and the gap between them is closing faster than most people watching either country individually realize. While all of this was happening, SpaceX was already pouring the foundation for what comes after Flight 13. And this is where the scale of the ambition really starts to show. Original Pad 1, sitting right next to Pad 2, is being rebuilt from the ground up, while Pad 2 is actively flight testing. Its flame trench has reached final depth, and crews are now preparing to crop the tops off 6 massive concrete piles to expose the steel reinforcement bar underneath, tying the entire trench structure together. That's not routine maintenance. That's SpaceX building a second full-strength launch complex in parallel with proving out the first one, a sequencing choice almost no other rocket program in the world would attempt. The tank farm north of the site has been reorganized just as aggressively. Small, older tanks have simply been removed to make room. New methane tank pedestals are filling every available gap. Once all 6 new tank positions are filled, there will be 0 unused space left anywhere in that farm. Every square foot is being converted into fuel storage capacity for a launch cadence that hasn't even begun yet. Meanwhile, at the Massey's test site, engineers spent the week reconfiguring a stress test cage specifically to push and pull on a booster header tank from multiple directions using newly installed steel supports, the kind of aggressive structural testing designed to catch weaknesses on the ground before they ever become a problem mid-flight. And the B-18.3 test unit just had its previous setup removed, so engineers could install arm simulators, essentially rehearsing catch arm behavior on a stationary test article instead of risking the very first attempt on a live flight vehicle. That single decision tells you SpaceX wants Pad 2's first real catch attempt to happen very soon after Flight 13, and they're not willing to leave the catch mechanism itself unvalidated going into it. You'd think that's enough proof of scale for 1 week. It isn't. The record that makes all of this possible. Here's the number that explains why SpaceX can afford to take the kind of risk they just took at Pad 2 in the first place, and it has nothing to do with Starship at all. Earlier the same week, Falcon 9 Booster 1067 landed for the 36th time, not the 36th launch of the overall Falcon 9 program. The 36th time that exact individual piece of hardware came home and flew again. One day later, Booster 1071 landed for the 35th time on a completely different mission. 2 boosters, 2 landings, 1 week, both closing in on the 40 flight mark that would have sounded like science fiction a decade ago. Here's why that number actually matters for everything you just watched at Pad 2. A company that lands the same piece of hardware 36 times has an enormous real-world data set on exactly how metal behaves under repeated stress, repeated re-entry heat, repeated engine cycling. That's not theoretical confidence built in a simulator. That's confidence earned across 3 dozen real flights on a single piece of hardware. When you have that much lived experience with reusability, skipping a spin prime test on a super heavy booster stops looking reckless and starts looking like a company that's simply run out of reasons to stay cautious about a class of problem it has already solved 36 times over. And there's a smaller detail buried in that same week's launch schedule that hints at where all of this obsession with reusability is actually heading next. Riding along on Booster 1090's 13th flight were 2 experimental manufacturing pods built by a company called Bezar. Their goal has nothing to do with landing rockets. Their goal is building the first reusable orbital foundries, factories that operate in space itself. The test was simple. Strap the pods to the outside of a booster that's already flying anyway, and measure how well they survive the exact same launch and re-entry environment the booster experiences. Reusability didn't stop at not throwing away a rocket booster. It's quietly becoming a free testing platform for the next generation of space manufacturing, 1 hitchhiking pod at a time. Texas gets almost all the attention, but the Florida Gigabay just quietly hit a milestone that explains exactly how SpaceX plans to scale Starship production once Flight 13 and Flight 14 prove the vehicle works. A 420-ton bridge crane was just installed inside the Florida Gigabay, and its entire job is lifting Starship and super heavy vehicles back upright after they arrive horizontally from Texas. That number isn't random. The bridge cranes currently used inside the Texas megabays can only lift 180 tons each, which means SpaceX has often needed 2 cranes working in tandem just to move a single vehicle, a workaround, not a real solution. The new Gigabay crane more than doubles that single crane capacity in 1 piece of equipment. At the same time, the crane building the Gigabay's structure itself, a brand new LR1300, has been tearing through construction at a pace that looks almost unfair compared to the Texas site, finishing entire building levels in days instead of weeks. Part of the reason is space. The Florida site has far less room to work with than Texas. So instead of rolling equipment around the building level by level, crews are installing wall cladding in large prefabricated sections, building big and lifting big instead of building small and repeating. Here's the pattern worth sitting with. Every single piece of infrastructure being built right now in Texas and in Florida, on the ground and in orbit, is being sized for a production rate that hasn't happened yet. Bigger cranes, bigger tank farms, bigger catch systems. SpaceX isn't building for the Starship program as it exists today. They're building for a Starship program that launches far more often than it currently does. And Booster 20's record static fire is one of the very last pieces of proof needed before that faster cadence can actually begin. What's still unresolved? So where does all of this actually leave us going into next week? Booster 20 has proven it can handle the most demanding static fire in the program's history, on engines that were pulled for caution and cleared through inspection, on a pad that had never absorbed full power before. The catch arms have proven their resonance behavior at the top of the tower. The FAA has locked in a launch window. On paper, every major unknown standing between Booster 20 and Flight 13 has now been checked off. But checked off on paper isn't the same as proven in flight. Stage separation still has to go cleanly in real conditions, not just in a static test on the ground. The vacuum Raptor relight still has to fire correctly in the vacuum of space, not in a controlled environment at Starbase. And Pad 2 still has to prove it can survive an actual launch, not just a static fire, because a rocket leaving the ground puts forces on a pad that a bolted-down engine test simply can't replicate. So here's where we leave it, and here's what you should be watching for over the next several days. If the FAA's July 15th window holds, Flight 13 becomes the mission that either confirms everything Booster 20 just proved, or reveals that a static fire and an actual launch are two very different tests entirely. And if China's Long March 10B really does fly again before the end of the year, the way officials are claiming, we could be looking at two completely different booster recovery systems from two different countries, both proving themselves operational in the same 12-month stretch. Which one do you think ends up mattering more for who actually gets back to the moon first? Drop your answer below, because that question is about to get a lot more interesting very soon. The date is clear. SpaceX earned that margin fair and square. Thanks for breaking it down with us. Like, share, comment, subscribe to the Space Brief, and check the video on your screen next.